I'm not pulling in my driveway. We all know what that means. It's time for another Drive to Work at Home edition. So I have Ari Nieh with me today to talk all about the making of the Brothers War. Hey, Ari.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Okay, so you led the vision design, but our story starts way even before the vision design. So
it does. It starts like with a flashback to the past, like just going along with the Brothers War theme.
Yeah, a good theme. So we'll dig up our artifacts to see what we can find out about the past.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think our story begins, actually not with either of us. The story begins with Ethan Fleischer. And Ethan Fleischer was asked by one of the people who one of our producers about what are cool ideas for supplemental sets. He pitches the idea of Brothers War. Aaron gets the idea, and Aaron comes to me and asks, what do I think of the idea? I said I thought it was a great idea. And then he's like, do you think it could be a standard set? You know, a premiere set? I'm like, yeah, definitely. For sure it could be. And he's like, he thought too, but he needed proof of concept so he could go to, you know, his bosses and stuff and say, I think we should do this, not just as a set, but as a premiere set. So he then gives me the task of making a demo. So I turn to you and I say, Ari, we need to make a demo. So what is your memory of starting from me coming to you?
Right. So this was in the fall of 2018 when I just got started at Wizards, and you were like, I want you to think about some things like as potential things for us to work on in the future. I want you to think about unsets, and I want you to think about Brothers War. Like, what could we do with Brothers War? And you and I talked about it some more. And then you said, all right, let's make a prototype. You know, you're going to make 2 decks. I don't remember how we decided exactly what form the prototype would have, but as a proof of concept, we were going to have 2 decks that showcased, if we were to build a set, what are like 2 imaginary constructed decks that would play against each other, that would, you know, they're like sort of dual decks that show off a whole standard set's worth of stuff, that show what the Brothers War could be.
And I think Urza versus Mishra was like from the very, very beginning, right?
Yeah, it was. I mean, that was just obvious. Is that, of course, Urza versus Mishra is how we're going to show this off.
Okay, so I mean, you and I talked quite a bit about sort of what should be in it. So what is your memory of, like, what were the parameters? Like, what did we feel had to be in it?
It was obviously going to be an artifact themed set. That was clear from the beginning. We knew there would be some kind of graveyard theme to at least one of the factions, since digging up old artifacts, digging up the Thran was part of it. We knew there was going to be some kind of like tinkering or building up sort of theme because this is not just a set about artifacts like Mirrodin is, but it's a set about artificers, the people who build them. And also I think that it was going to be about war, right? That this is the Brothers' War. And so we knew it was going to hit all those themes from the very start. I don't remember what parameters you gave me in terms of what else was required. Like, we knew we were going to have a bunch of antiquities callbacks, of course.
Yeah, I think so. So the one thing that I think I said I wanted, and you didn't disagree with me or anything, was the idea that we wanted all the artifacts to be generic in their costs.
Yes.
But we knew that we needed to have color in there somewhere, just because we've learned our lesson about making generic artifact sets full of generic artifacts. But I think what we had said, and this is from the very beginning of, okay, we want the mana cost to be generic mana, that they could have color in them, and, you know, obviously they could be optimized with color. But I think we were trying to capture that. It had to be Urza and me. Aaron, from the very beginning, had talked about being interested in meld. And so in the very first promo versions, we had meld Urza and meld Mishra. That was from the very beginning.
We did, yes. And we had Urza. In fact, it was with, I think, the flavor underpinnings for what they meld with, like the Power Stones, the Might Stone, the Weak Stone, and the Dragon Engine. Those come directly from the story. That's not something we made up for the cards. So those were there in the prototype that we made in 2018, and Urza turning into this ridiculous 6 ability planeswalker, and Mishra turning into some, massive 6 ability creature. Those we had in our prototype.
Okay, so and then one of the things that you suggested, which I think when I forget which deck it went into. I think it went into the Mishra deck, but you suggested Unearth. That was something that you had suggested
Right.
during the promo when we were building the promo decks.
Yeah, I went back and looked through my notes for this from like one of my first notebooks at Wizards, and like the very first idea I wrote down under Brothers War was Unearth on artifacts, um, and so in these promo decks, Mishra had a bunch of, it had a bunch of self mill from the black side and some rummaging from the red side. So you could like fill your graveyard with artifacts. It had a bunch of sack outlets for artifacts, and then you would unearth them and get double value out of them.
And then the Urza deck we were fiddling around more with, like, I think the Mishra deck was more about digging things out of the graveyard, and then the Urza deck was more about building things, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, and like that was a reflection of their personalities, right? That like that they've always been a little that Urza is more the creator and Mishra is more the destroyer. Although, of course, in the context of the war itself, they both just destroyed the entire continent. But yes, the Urza deck used a mechanic that nowadays we call A plus B meld, where like you could take one part of a robot, like a core, and one other part of a robot that was like the body of the robot, and mix and match them together, and they would flip and meld into whatever combined those two things, which would have a combination of the abilities and stats of its component robots.
Okay, so we build these two decks. And I should stress, I mean, I was definitely helping you, but I put you in charge of this. So this was something that you did.
Yeah. Mostly I built the decks and you gave me feedback on them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I designed a few cards, but you did the lion's share of putting the decks together. And then I know you played with a lot of people to get feedback. And then you and I played a couple times, and I gave you feedback. And then once I said we were ready, we then went and played with Aaron Forsyth.
Yes.
And then basically the story is Aaron liked it. He then took the same decks and played with Ken Troop and Bill Rose and the other people to sort of get sign off. Everybody says, "Oh, this looks great. Let's do it." Okay, so now because you had obviously showed a lot of promise and I thought you'd done great work on the demo decks, I said, "Ari, could you lead the vision design for this?"
Which of course I was really excited to do. It's kind of what I was most excited about winning the Great Designer Search and coming to Wizards is I want to lead a vision design team. So if this was my first chance to do so, which was really a very unique opportunity.
Okay, so let's talk about where we started. Like we unlike most sets, we had done some work. We had built decks. We had some themes and mechanics. So where did you start? Like what was how did the design start?
Yeah, so we started by like looking at these decks. So this was unfortunately like we were starting right at the beginning of the pandemic, was around when exploratory design began. I think that was April 2020. Mm-hmm. So our play testing pipeline at the time was a little janky. Mm-hmm. So we were mostly talking about. At that stage, we were talking about themes and talking about how we were going to approach things, because this is not at all a typical standard set. Like in many ways, the design of Brothers War was like the design of a Universes Beyond set, because the world was settled for us, the prominent characters were settled for us, that like what objects and locations had to appear in this set, those were all nailed down for us, and the story and the arc of the story were there for us. So the questions for us were not, okay, here are rough themes, what can we make out of it? And then we fill in the details later. The questions are, the details are all here. How do we connect the dots? And what is the right way to portray all these things? What's the approach we are going to take with this story?
So there were a couple of challenges. So, here's the one that I remember. You can talk through the other challenges as well. The one I remember was the story wasn't that kind of green. Like there wasn't a lot going on. Like for example, when we made the decks, we made the Urza deck white blue, and we made the Mishra deck black red in the original demo decks that we made for Aaron. And it was clear that like white and blue and black and red, there's plenty of things to do in the Brothers War. But green, it was in weird space. So let's talk a little bit about like, and this happens a lot with Universes Beyond, interestingly enough, where like the story is the story. It wasn't necessarily balanced for the color wheel.
Yep.
So how did we address that?
Yeah, and like not only with Universes Beyond, but I think artifact sets in general, there's always a question like with what does green do? Like green is the color that has the least artifact synergies just built in with its place in the color wheel. So there were a few things. One, the biggest one is the island of Argoth, which is where the story ends in the third act. And we were thinking at one point of, there's a 3-act structure to the story, right? There's the youth of the brothers and the middle age when they're adults, building their empires and fighting the war. And then there's old age when things come to a head and get like really just absolute environmental devastation. And that's when they go to Argoth and fight their big final battle. And one thing that we eventually decided was that we were not going to try to make these 3 acts all equal, right? That it was okay if different acts emphasized different parts of the color pie. It was okay if different acts sort of showed up more and less at different rarities. Like we weren't going to try to balance them, and the raw number of cards didn't have to be the same. So we could put a lot of emphasis on the defenders of Argoth, right? On the elves and the pixies and the sentinel druids and people like Titania and Gwenna, that we could flesh those out a little more than you would think in a set that's called The Brothers War. It's not just the brothers, right? It's about the people they affect.
And that's another interesting thing is we spent a lot of time. I mean, I know we looked through the book and looked at all the characters, but there's a lot of factions that aren't the brothers fighting. There are other factions that come into play. And I know we spent a lot of time like making sure we represented those as well.
Absolutely. And that was also one of the places where we looked for like room to flex in the color pie, that, the factions in Brothers War, like it's not a faction set. It's not a Ravnica or Strixhaven style set where like you have these strict, okay, if you belong to this faction, then that means you're exactly these 2 colors because the faction represents these colors in its underlying philosophy. Like the Philagi, for example, that follow Mishra, they're not defined by, the philosophies of red as a color and black as a color are what make us, so that you could conceivably have people who are Philagi but are green or another color. Similarly, like we looked in factions like the Third Path, right? The people at the Ivory Tower. We're like, well, these people could be a lot of different colors. Like they're exploring artifice, they're exploring magic, they want peace. Like there's definitely some colors that they have to be, but like, we tried to explore that and make sure we could find color balance in by like looking at the different people in the world and how they might manifest, not just narrowly the brothers are this, and so everyone who follows them is this.
Okay, so let's start talking mechanics. Yeah. So obviously we went in looking at the mechanics we had done in the demo decks. Mm-hmm. But how did we get to the mechanics that you handed off?
So, well, at the time of handoff, well, we were definitely happy with, we had Power Stones that had been settled pretty early on because, Ethan and I had agreed, want this mechanic.
Ethan Fleischer had done Dominar United, just to explain. Yes. Yeah, so, okay.
And we agreed that would be a great mechanic to carry over between the 2 sets, right? Because the Power Stones have such a pivotal role in the story of the Brothers War. But there should still be some left on Dominaria today for people to be building up. In general, we wanted to connect the two sets in little ways, just so that people were like, oh yes, we have these two consecutive sets, and even though they're very different, we can tell they took place on the same world, and in the way this one that comes later laid the grounds for what Dominaria would become 4,500 years in the future.
I think the plan for Dominaria United, by the way, was they put them in and then said, Brothers will figure out what Power Stones do exactly, and we'll just update once they figure out exactly what they do. Because they knew that there's going to have more of a role in the Brothers War than it would in Dominaria United.
Yes. I think during exploratory design, we came up with Prototype, which was this ability that would let you cast an artifact creature as a smaller version of itself for less mana. So it's kind of like a reverse kicker, though it's not quite kicker because the big version is allowed to be 100% colorless. And this was, as you mentioned, another of our like sneaky ways of making colorless artifact cards that aren't really colorless, that like you have to have lands of the appropriate type in your deck in order to get the most out of them.
Yeah, and one of the cool things about Prototype is there are actually archetypes in Draft, for example, where you might not have the color to play the small version of the Prototype, but it ramps into enough mana, you can play the big versions of the Prototype.
Mm-hmm. And that's another thing Power Stones were really good for.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was a nice fit, and we were pretty happy with that. For our graveyard mechanic, when at the time of Vision Handoff, we were not using Unearth. We were using something that we called Scrap, which I believe was one of your ideas, Mark. It was
Yes.
more or less artifact mutate from the graveyard. So if I had some artifact that was in my graveyard, I could pay some mana and exile it to grant all of its abilities to one of my artifacts on the battlefield permanently.
Yeah, the flavor that I liked a lot, I mean, where it came from was a lot of the story of the Brothers' War is Urza and Mishra like finding old artifacts made by the Thran and stuff, but then adapting them and sort of turning it into their own purposes. And I thought it was kind of neat that you could sort of take things out of the graveyard and make use of them to change what you're building. Anyway, I like I said, I thought it was flavorfully really interesting, and it definitely made for weird, like very Johnny-ish designs where like you cobble things together and it did something kind of neat in the interactions.
I think that was what a lot of us liked about it, is that it was the flavor of invention made very concrete, and in particular it connected it sort of on both of the thematic ends that invention has in Brothers' War. Like it connected it with the archaeology end because you're digging stuff up, and it connected it with like the warfare end where I'm like repurposing something that I found in the dirt and like now grafting it onto my golem or my war tank to make that thing more powerful somehow. We thought that was super cool. It ended up being, I think, a little too complex, a little too challenging. And so partway into set design, we got feedback from people saying like, hey, there is a little too much going on here. We can't quite understand it. And so we went to our backup graveyard mechanic, which was Unearth instead.
Yeah, so during Vision, by the way, we did make Unearth cards. Like, we did design Unearth cards, and it was always a given. Like, we knew that Scrap was asking a little much, and like, it has so one of the things we do in design, just so the audience understands, is when you sort of push, when you sort of do something that's a little, is a little more out there, one of the things we do is we'll make backups for it saying, hey, we're trying something, but if this experiment doesn't quite work out, here's the more easy thing we know you can do.
Yeah, and like that's sort of part of just our vision design methodology is like to take big swings, right? To like try things that you think might work and might not work. So that like if they do work, fantastic, you tried something that was more ambitious than you would have otherwise. And if it doesn't work, then like you have backups for set design to implement. But that enables us to take the big risks.
Okay, so speaking of swings, But we talked about there was a lot of complexity. Let's talk about some other stuff there's a few other things that we
Yes.
handed over. So we obviously, the finished product has the 3 meld pairs at Rare Mythic Rare of Urza and Mishra, and then we added Titania, so we balanced it out since we had white, blue, and black, red, but we didn't have green. And that was, I think we very early decided to do that. I think that was...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But we had common meld cards. So let's talk a little bit about the common meld cards that we handed over. Do you remember these?
Yes, that's right. So our common meld cards were it was a cycle, so 1 pair for each color, and each cycle consisted of 1 artifact creature and 1 sorcery or instant spell. So this was again a sneaky way to make things colored without actually, while the artifact still looks colorless. That what you do is you have a red spell that's like some kind of flamethrower thing, like some sort of torch, and then an artifact creature which is some sort of vehicle, not the card type vehicle, but like a cart or something, and then you would exile the red spell, the sorcery or instant spell, from your graveyard to meld it with your... Was it from your graveyard? I think it was. Yeah, you'd pay a cost and exile it from your graveyard to meld it with your little cart, and then you would have a flamethrower cart instead, which was more powerful, and it had an activated ability that like mimicked the function of the spell. So the idea flavorfully is like, here is some peaceful tool, right? Some peaceful like welding torch that I am now going to glue to my cart, which is also like just a minecart or something. And then I'm making a flaming minecart that I can use as a war machine to send at my brother whom I hate.
Yeah, and the idea was when we had done meld way back in Eldritch Moon, which is where I got introduced, we didn't. I think there was a vertical cycle, so there was 1 common thing.
Yeah.
But it just, people had always said, "Oh, we want to see more meld." It was hard to like do that, and so we were trying to get meld at a lower rarity. There were a whole bunch of issues with it. The As fans is quirky. It requires a lot of infrastructure to make it work. And part of the lesson we got when we handed it all off was there's just too much going on. And I think part of making it a little simpler was taking out the common meld.
Yeah, and I think, overall, like, meld just kind of presents a problem in that, like, you want the difference between the 2 cards individually and the power of them put together to be not too small, right? Like, it has to be a little big so it's a reward. Like, all right, I did the thing. I put the 2 pieces together and now I feel really cool. But if it's too big, then that means that your individual pieces are too weak, and so you don't take them to begin with, so you never start drafting them, so it's hard to fall into the archetype.
And even with draft, like, because it's 2 pieces, like, how do we exactly get the same person to draft both pieces? And that's tricky as well.
Right.
Like in booster packs, we have the technology now that we could, in theory, have them show up in the same booster pack. But if you drafting, you pick one of them. I think one day we will crack common meld in a way that's viable, but it's going to require a set that, like, that's what it's doing. It requires a lot of structure to make it work. And this set had a lot going on, so in the end, it just wasn't the right place for it.
Yeah. So one other mechanic that we had at handoff that I believe eventually got cut was raid. We had raid in the set, and because, raid is just it's a fine mechanic it's all about sort of attacking, and so it encourages aggression, and it sort of encourages different things from these decks that are these artifact based that are all about ramping into giant things. And also that was a cool opportunity to put raid in green, since that would be the flavor for like the Argothians fighting off the invaders. And I think that wasn't cut for any structural reasons. That was probably just cut for space.
Yeah, so I mean, the reason we put it in originally was it was a war, and all the mechanics we had done were more about invention and building things. And we were like, oh, but we really need something about war, right? We need something that encouraged fighting, because that is an important part of it. And I think what happened was when they took out Scrap and replaced it with Unearth, Unearth also does this good job of promoting aggression, because when you unearth a creature, look, it's going to go away at the end of turn. Why not attack with the creature? So I think Unearth filled a little bit of that void. And when they were when they were trying to cut for space and stuff, I think that they're like, well, Unearth's doing enough of that we can make some individual cards to do that they didn't feel they needed Raid. I mean, everybody likes Raid. I mean, Raids are always good in sets. It's one of those mechanics that, like, no set's unhappy having Raid. You know, it's a game about attacking with creatures. So, okay. So
should I talk a bit about the mechanics that we cut sort of before handoff?
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's talk about stuff that we tried.
I think this was kind of interesting that, like, when we were trying to decide, like, what is the big splashy mechanic with the most sort of not mechanical novelty to it? You know, what are our sort of, like, what vehicles were to Kaladesh or something like that? There were three directions that we considered going in, and Scrap was the one we ended up picking. But I think people might be interested in hearing what the two others were.
They would. Absolutely.
So one of them was the mechanic from the 2018 proof of concept decks that we made, which was the A+B meld, right? Where you have cards where any A can meld with any B. In some ways that solves certain problems with meld, but of course it also created a lot more. We thought this was super cool, but its biggest problem was that it was very parasitic, right? That, like, these cards work with each other and they don't really work with anything else, that's not great.
There was one other problem with it, by the way, which is I went to our art people, because the problem is any front has to go with any back.
Right. And the art people were like, are you serious?
Yeah, like, so we obviously Unstable messed around with this with Host Augment, but we kind of leaned into the silly there as, like, it's the head of this and the tail of that, and it was kind of entertaining and fun, but it was goofy, and it worked in that set because that set was sort of a goofy set. But there was a lot of resistance when we talked to the art. Like, they didn't think that they could come up with. I mean, one day maybe we'll do it and we'll come up with a solution, but they did. There wasn't an obvious solution to them.
Yeah, and I think the other major problem was with the rise of Commander. Like, it's less appealing to have a mechanic in your set where, like, part of what makes it work is you can have 4 of each card, right? That I have 4 of this A and 4 of that A and 4 of this B and 4 of that B. So altogether I have 8 plus 8 in my 60 card deck. I can make it work. I'll find a way to combine them. But if I just have 1 of each in my 100 card deck, it's like, this just isn't going to happen.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Okay, what was the third path? You said there were 3 paths.
Yes, just as in the Brothers War, there's a third path. The third idea, which I think was also very interesting, was an exploration of colorless mana as colorless costs that is different from how it was done in the
Oath of the Gatewatch.
In Oath of the Gatewatch. In particular, the idea was, what if we genuinely, instead of just having a few weirdo colorless cards that, like, represent the Eldrazi because they're strange and alien, what if we went all in on colorless equals Thran artifacts and we made it a whole 6th color, right? That, like, in your draft environment, instead of, you have 5 colors to pick from, and so there's like 10 signpost uncommons, 1 for each 2 color pair, like 5 choose 2 is 10. Instead, you have 6 colors, right? The normal 5 plus colorless, and there's an equal number of colorless cards at least at common and uncommon, so that it can work out in limited, right? There's an equal number of colorless cards, and there's signpost uncommons for each archetype. So there's 6 choose 2, right? 15 draft archetypes, like the 10 normal ones, and then each color, like white colorless, blue colorless, etc. We thought that would be super, super interesting. I think we decided not to do it for a few reasons. One was that, like, thus far in Magic, the flavor connection we've made between colorless costs and Eldrazi has been pretty strong. And so bringing that back in a block that's fundamentally disconnected from the Eldrazi, and where the Phyrexians are sort of the menacing underlying villain, seemed just a little bit of a mismatch flavor wise. I think we were also a little scared about like, how easy is it to build a draft environment with 6 colors instead of 5 and 15 archetypes instead of 10? Like, no one's ever done that. We don't know how easy or hard it is.
Well, I think the biggest thing about it was it's the kind of idea that like that's what the set has to be about. Like if you're doing it, it takes over everything, and that just
is the set.
Right. Our set was about the Brothers' War. That was the thing that guided us, and so it just sometimes ideas have too much volume. Like it just. Like, if you're going to do it, you got to do it. That's what it's about. And this set already had its central theme, which was, hey, we're capturing the story. And I think that was the biggest problem with it, was it wasn't fundamentally what the story was about, and so it just was sort of hijacking things and taking them somewhere else.
Yeah, like you want a sort of like giant-sized mechanical theme with this beautiful, intricate constraint like that. You want that for a bottom-up set, right? Like, that's how you build your sets, like, Dragons of or like the Tarkir block or Strixhaven or whatever, where you're like, it's about this thing, and then you build your set around that entirely. And you can't do that for what is essentially a Universes Beyond set.
Yeah, I mean, this was very much a top-down set. It's very much, we are capturing this story. That's what we're capturing. In some ways, it's kind of what we call an event set, right? It's built around a story.
And the model I was taking for this set, like the set that I thought we needed to most emulate, was War of the Spark.
Right, like, was our first event set. So
yeah, and it's not a top-down set like Eldraine is a top-down set, because Eldraine looks at like individual tropes. It's like, oh, we've got our golden goose and our gingerbread man, right, and Jack the Giant Slayer. Like that's card by card top down, and we do some card by card top down in Brothers War. Like we're giving you your legendary creatures and your dragon engine and your Onulet and things like that. But like we're also more top down the story. Yeah. What we care about more is top down. Here's what happened in the Brothers War. Here's this iconic event that takes place over decades and decades. We want to show the magnitude of that war, the sweep of it, and its effect on the inhabitants of Terra Sierra.
Yeah, so anyway, I can see my desk here, so I'm not too far from work, so we got to wrap up here. Yeah, one of the things that I'm real happy with, like I think we did a great job, and the set designers after us, like of really making something that does capture the Brothers' War in a way that's really fun. And I know, I mean, the amount of work that you and the team everybody put into, like, what are all the characters and what are all the places and the things, and there was so much time and energy trying to get all the there's a lot of like Easter eggs on some level here, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like when you're doing this kind of fan service, if you will, like if you're doing something that you're like, okay, this is for the longtime players and the hardcore Vorthoses who really care about the story and the people and the places that make up this world, like you've got to deep dive and do it right. And so, both the creative world building team, which Emily Tang was leading that side of it at the time, and people like Ethan Fleischer, who has read every single Magic novel in existence. He was an amazing resource for getting all of our deep cuts exactly the way we wanted them.
Yeah, so anyway, I'm like I said, I'm excited for the players to actually get a chance to play it. It's a really fun set, and it plays really well. The thing I love about top-down sets is when the gameplay itself matches the feel you're trying to get out of the story. And look, the gameplay is about you're going to build giant artifact machines, and you're going to smash them into your opponent's artifact machines, and I think that's great. So
I'm really looking forward to it.
So any last thoughts before we wrap up today? Any last thoughts on the Brothers' War?
I'm just really so excited to see it in stores. So you know this, but the listeners may not. I actually left Wizards before the Brothers' War was all the way complete. It was partway through set design at the time that I left. So I'd seen some of the artwork for it. I'd seen some of the concept push. But now that preview season is starting and I'm getting to see like the final art for it and all the different concepts for these cards, some of these cards go back to 2018, like that for me is just supremely exciting, and I just can't wait to go to the pre-release myself.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being with us today, Ari. It's always great talking with you.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
To everybody else, guys, I am at my desk. So we all know what that means. It means it's the end of my drive to work. So instead of talking magic, it's time for me to be making magic. So thanks, Ari, and I'll see all you next time. Bye-bye.